Good morning. Continuing our review and summation of the conclusion of Hemshech Ayin Beis from volume 3 on top of page 1466. We have approximately 11 more pages to go to the conclusion of Ayin Beis, second time around, because after we finished this a few years ago, I don't remember exactly how long ago, we went back, since the Rebbe Rashab did not conclude the Hemshech, we went back to relearning some of the source texts that Ayin Beis, this end of Ayin Beis, is based on, namely the Maimorim of Chanukah, Mika Shemalakenu Magbil L'Sheves in Torah from the Alter Rebbe Chanukah, and in the Mittler Rebbe Maimori Admoram Tzoi. We learned also a piece from Torah Shalom from the Rebbe Rashab, and I believe another piece, I don't remember which piece, but bottom line is to provide context and background, and also there explicitly questions and themes that were not finished in Ayin Beis are specifically addressed there, are answered there. So from that we can extrapolate how this Hemshech would have continued most likely. So now we're learning it in that, with that framework in mind, with that context in mind, which helps appreciate also many different details and nuances and an overall picture of what we're learning. So right now we're smack right in the middle of that theme in the Maimer HaMagbil L'Sheves, which is essentially about Ner Hashem Nishma Sodam, Ner Mitzvah, and Torah Eir, how these three things combine to create the ability to transform this world. These are the main forces that neshama comes down below and manifests inside of a body, and the animal soul is concealed in the process, and using its natural neshamadik and nefesh alikis aveda, plus the asset of a ner mitzvah, mitzvahs, and Torah is able to not just overcome, but to actually affect and impact the animal soul and its environment and the entire physical world, to turn it into a home for godliness. So we're in the middle of the discussion of how the nefesh alikis does that with the nefesh abamis. He more or less already summed it up and gave us pretty solid formula. When I say solid, meaning taking the Maimer of the Alter Rebbe and the Mittler Rebbe, the Rebbe Rashab, adding many points, which we've been learning. The Seder Haveda, which primarily is about the engagement of the divine soul, specifically its faculties, and the faculties break into two: Seichel, intelligence, cognitive faculties, Chachma Bina Das, and Midas, emotional faculties, which is the Midas, from Chesed through Malchus. And through a Seichel of the Nefesh is manifesting within the Seichel of the Nefesh Abamis, meaning that when the divine soul, whose entire exclusive focus is godliness, understands a godly idea, and we're going to learn more detail about Shema Yisrael, that is Bonus of Hashem Echad, but understands it through the lens of the Seichel Hativi of the Nefesh Abamis, which means with, like you said, Meshalim, Dimyonis, examples, comparisons, parallels, but it's understood through a Seichel of the Nefesh Abamis, so then the Nefesh Abamis can also appreciate it. It's the language of the Nefesh Abamis. So though the Nefesh Abamis on its own would naturally gravitate to its own needs and desires, however, the Seichel of Nefesh L'Kis can engage with that. And then in turn comes the next step, which is that's Shema V'Havtas Hashem Elokecha. They say to us, awakening and stimulation of the divine soul's love for God, in turn also impresses and has an impact on the Nefesh L'Kis. And both these things together become a potent force until the point V'Havtas Hashem Elokecha b'chol levavcha b'shnei yitzarech. The last piece we learned was that he said that Yesh Leimer, that the Nefesh Abamis in general is called Shemen. Not just the Chochmah, the Seichel of the Nefesh Abamis, but the Nefesh Abamis in general becomes now fuel, meaning it's Seichel and also it's Midas, its entire being. And he explains why, because the root of the Nefesh Abamis comes from a very essential place, Toihu. The thing with Toyu, however, is chaotic. It's unbalanced, but there is intensity there, just an unbalanced intensity. So being that it's Shadish is Toyu, and the shemen of everything is the etzem of the thing, like we said, the very core, what he called Techiz ve'atzmus, like he brought the example from how oil, one drop of oil, and he gave the comes from Toyu. It has a very essential, it's very like a concentrated intensity, and the spheres of Toyu are the keser in every sphere. That's the atzmus of the sphere, and that's what gives the neshabamis such intensity. That's why Rav Tfu is b'kayach sheir, that like just like an animal, much more powerful than a human being, and can produce a lot more when harnessed, of course. And he gave the example of the essentia of the mashke, of a drink. We've been talking about what that is, but essentially it's the extract or the concentrate of a powerful ingredient that when it's mixed with other liquid, with other mashke, it can mesakne. Here it says mesakne can be repaired, it can sweeten it, can change its flavor. Same thing, the beer of the Nefesh Habamis has that power that it actually, just like in the same sense, when it is affected, it in turn gives Oyer taste for Seir, he said, so it has that intensity. And that's what the Nefesh Habamis in turn gives to the Nefesh Elikis. So it's like shemen, oil, that feeds the flame, the candle, much more than the wick does. Because the more the oil is there, the more the flame will burn properly, and so on. And that's why the Nefesh Habamis in general is called Shemesh, Koyach Atzmi, and it's drawn after, and it follows, and it's drawn, Nimshach Acher, it is drawn toward the wick of the Nefesh Elikis. The Nefesh Elikis descends to refine the animal soul, to the point that it transforms Chashechel and Naheda, darkness, to light. And then it's nichlal, it's absorbed in the light of the Nefesh Elikis, and that makes the Neir one candle, one cohesive candle, being fed by the shemen of being fed by the shemen of the Nefesh Habamis, which is being drawn into the psila, in turn creating this Ur, this powerful Ur. That's where we stopped, the second line on page 1466. So this is essentially the Maimar Magbeel Shevis of the Alter Rebbe and the Mittler Rebbe, but with the Rebbe Rashab's additions. And of course, the context, we learned the last over 100 pages, talking about this whole Yuridis of the Neshama coming down below, and the process of it going through the darkness, Shcheirani, Venova, and all the other details, which I'm not going to go through right now. We've already reviewed it many times. So the next piece, to the end of the paragraph, is going to focus more about this bittul of the Nefesh Habamis, and suffice it to say that because the Rebbe Rashab did not finish Ayin Beis, he definitely would come back to this, but he's now laying the ground of how you affect the Nefesh Elikis, affects the Nefesh Habamis. So we're going to learn in the next paragraphs, all the way till the end of the Hemshech, the actual Yisbonanus. What exactly is the Nefesh Elikis teaching the Nefesh Habamis? He didn't tell us that yet. He just said in general terms that an Ayin Eliki of the Nefesh Elikis, with Slapshus and the Nefesh Habamis appreciates. And we know it's Shema. But what are the details? That we're going to learn soon. But meanwhile, he's still talking about how much it impacts the Nefesh Habamis. And the question is, how far does it go? And he's going to say now it goes quite far. So even though in Tanya, as a small introduction before we read on, in Tanya, he does say, as it was mentioned yesterday in the class, that only by a tzaddik does he ultimately either eliminate the Yetzer Hara and the Nefesh Habamis, or even transforms it, as he explains in chapter 10 in Tanya, whereas a Beinani does not. A Beinani can subdue, can control the Nefesh Habamis, that it shouldn't affect thought, speech, and action, but that is in the beginning of Aveda. That's the Aveda, that the usual Aveda that all of us are engaged with right now, and throughout the years, but ultimately the goal is transformation of the animal soul. Question is to what extent? And of course, when we talk La'asid Love, where the Yetzer Hara will be then completely transformed, Eibishter will shecht, it says. He'll slaughter the animal, the Yetzer Hara, but it also says it'll be like the Nachash in the Gan Eden will be a Shamish Gadol, will be a great assistant. There'll be a force that will assist and support the Nefesh Elikis. So there is the ultimate transformation. It doesn't explain in detail the difference between Tanya and La'asid Love, But clearly, he's definitely talking about stages, and Ayin Beis he's taking it much further than in Tanya, because the Tanya speaks mostly about the Aveda, the present Aveda of the battle, and also there are levels of Abeni and so on. But we'll talk about that more as well later. I just wanted to make that clear. There was one other thing before I continue, being that we're talking about, there was a question that someone sent me, Meir actually sent it to me in writing. I said I would address it. So let me tell you the question. I thought it was a good question and quite relevant. So I'll just read the question briefly. We're learning very simple cases where a person has one godly soul and only one animal soul. Yes. But how many people, due to trauma and abuse, were taken away not only from their godly soul, but from their own animal soul as well? They are disassociated from their animalistic midas, even more than with their godly midas. What language can we use for communication with a person who lives in a fake virtual reality that serves for him or her as a shield from pain, shame, misery that they can't deal with? Whom do we have to address? Their nefesh abamis is also in captivity. You would not be able to reach it. Then what? So the beautiful methodology seems to be irrelevant in those cases. Okay, it's a good question. In other words, everything we're discussing is based on a premise that a person's nefesh abamis is capable of listening. It's not listening yet, but if the nefesh alakiz does a good job of explaining and understand, contemplating on and explaining to itself the divine unity of Hashem Echad in a way that the nefesh abamis can understand. So it's like engaging with I want to say a captive audience. Initially, is a hostile audience, but ultimately, the nefesh abamis, you get its attention, and nefesh abamis listens, and slowly is affected. What level of effect? Okay, there are different levels. Then, like he said, then the midas of the nefesh abamis will also respond to the midas of the nefesh alakis. So when the nefesh alakis is ablaze, like a flame, with passion and love for godliness, that too will affect the nefesh abamis. But like I gave the example with mediation, what happens if you can't get the person into the room? He won't come to talk, not to the mediator, and definitely not to his antagonist, to his adversary. What do you do then? Psychologically speaking, there are people who have a nefesh l'kis, nefesh abamis, but they're so trapped in their own either delusions or their own traumas or their own pain and suffering, where they may have become narcissistic. I'm just embellishing on the question. And unfortunately, there are many people in that situation, not healthy, psychologically, emotionally healthy. So it seems that the premise in Ayin Beis, you could say the same thing in Tanya, is based on at least a healthy nefesh abamis. What I mean by that is not that the nefesh abamis obviously has its own selfish desires, but it's still what we call bedara de'una. It's still capable of being spoken to. Question is, how do you harness it and how do you channel it? We all have this. The fact is, every human being has desires and temptations, and the material world is very seductive and very compelling, and it's a battle. We all know that. But there is situation, I'll just use an example from the Shalah, which when we say al-chet, there's an expression, al-chet shechatanu b'yetzer hara. So the Shalah is the question, what do you mean? All chatoim come from the yetzer hara. When we say Yom Kippur, al-chet, every chet comes from the yetzer hara. What means al-chet shechatanu b'yetzer hara? Why is that a specific al-chet? The rest are all specific transgressions. And his answer is, because there's a sin where you yourself instigate the Yetzer Hara more than it would have been on its own. The Yetzer Hara has its temptations, has its desires, but there are times a person falls into a trap, into a vicious cycle that you start doing things that even your Yetzer Hara did not imagine. What that means when a person gets, for example, addicted to something. I'm just using an example. So initially, the Yetzer Hara had a desire for pleasure, had a desire for distraction, the instant gratification. But then, once it becomes an addiction, it starts getting much stronger than what the Yetzer Hara had in mind. No person no normal person, including the Yetzer Hara, wants to be addicted to anything, because that means you're trapped. It means you can't live without it. It's one thing, I want to have pleasure, great, but then what could happen is the pleasure takes over; it becomes a monster. and to the point that it is now controlling you. So that's a chetcha chatona b'yetzer hara, that you have done things that made your yetzer hara instigate your yetzer hara more than it would have done on its own. So it's just an example. So what do you do in a situation like that? Or to use the expression from the Baal Shem Tov, when he says, Anechi, says, Haster ponai b'yemahu, in Parsha Vayelech. One of the most devastating verses, if you think about it, that I will conceal double concealment of my face b'yemahu, in that day. Even the word b'yemahu is quite foreboding. Doesn't tell you what day. That day means in a day of darkness. So it can include the Holocaust, it can include the worst possible times in history where God's face is concealed. But he says haster aster. He doesn't say once, says twice. Says the Baal Shem Tov that there's two levels of darkness. There's a darkness, it's dark. Dark at night. You also know in the morning the dawn will break and the sun will rise, and it'll be a day. After evening comes morning. After night comes day. After darkness, light. But then there's a haster aster, that the concealment itself is concealed. You don't even know it's dark. You can convince yourself darkness is light. Good is evil. Evil is good. War is peace. Where you're such a distortion, like he says in the Pasuk in, I think, Yeshaya, that some immortal emotion, you think bitterness is sweet. And that's a person who's in such denial, they're not even aware of the problem. It's like someone who doesn't even know they have a problem. Awareness that it's night, that it's dark, at least tells you, okay, it's dark. Now I have to get beyond the darkness. Now, psychologically and emotionally speaking, that is the worst possible thing, because a person doesn't even think they need help. And when you tell them something's wrong, no, something wrong with you, something wrong with someone else, you're exaggerating, etc., etc. So this takes on many, many shapes and forms. So when you're dealing with such a situation, can you apply the formula or the principles that the Rebbe Rashab lays out here? So the answer is yes. And I'll explain how. So first of all, I should answer in two stages. The first answer is, like there's an expression, Le b'shuftin askinan, and generally speaking, Tanya and Ayin Beis, Achsidis is talking obviously to someone who's listening. If you're going to go to someone who's a mass murderer and say, let's learn a little Tanya or Ayin Beis, I'm talking about a real criminal, a corrupt person, a decadent person who's fallen to worse places. So first of all, they're not going to even come to listen to you. Like I said, they're not even capable. So how could you apply? It's like it says about the mitzvah of Amunah, Hashem. So there are many mitzvahs, some of the sages who say you don't count Amunah in the mitzvahs. Why? Because if you don't have Amunah, you're not going to listen to a mitzvah. So it's a premise that has to precede the mitzvahs. That first you accept that there's a mitzvah mitzvah. There's someone who's commanding mitzvahs. Then you can give them a mitzvah. But to say Amunah is a mitzvah, what happens if a person doesn't accept that? So in other words, there is a premise that I'm talking to someone that's like saying I'm talking to a sane person. If you go to an insane person, God forbid, someone who is in a place where you mentally disturbed or worse, and I'm not saying that necessarily in a condescending way, there's no one to talk to. They're not capable. You're not going to expect something from a person who's just not the capacity. Here, obviously, we're not talking about a natural handicap. We're talking about a person who's fallen in such a dark place. So the first thing I would say is, earlier in Ayin Beis, if you remember when he spoke about Mata Lamaila, that's when he spoke about distress. I referred to it a few times as hitting rock bottom. That distress is to the point that a person realizes there's something wrong. And that it was really reserved for the darkest of the dark, where a person has fallen so far, and really you can't do anything. You can't just open up an Ayin Beis and say, hey, let's learn a little Ayin Beis and you'll get out of it. I should correct myself, because the fact is every person, anyone who has a neshama, you could learn with, and maybe something will enter and plant a seed. So yes, if I met a mass murderer in prison, hopefully, I'd first turn him in, but if you want to start rehabilitating him, yeah, you could learn with him Torah and Chassidus, and maybe some spark will start engaging his neshama and waking something up. That's number one. But there, you need that ability that he has at least hit rock bottom, so there's some call. If a person is so far lost that they're not even calling, then there's no way to reach them. So you need to have something. You can't help someone who's not ready to help themselves. Even there, like I said, you still look. I've spoken to many audiences in my life, and sometimes there were people in the audience. Later, I found out that were very corrupt. Suffice it at that. There's much worse than that even. But they happen to be in the audience, whatever reason. They came with someone, or they were curious, and did it have an effect? You hope the neshama heard something. So it's not always that you can directly say, listen, let's say Shema together, and your Nefesh Habamis is going to listen to the Nefesh Halikis, and then is going to be affected by the emotions. I wouldn't expect that. But I would expect that you could begin by saying things. Who knows? You never know what will spark something in someone. A wake up, something. And maybe combined with, and sometimes the effect is not immediate. It can be an effect later. Now, as far as the actual formula itself, it's the same ultimate idea. Even a person like that, obviously, if they're not open to a conversation, and they're not even responding, they're not showing up, then what are you going to do? But if they are in some way, you're still trying to reach their nefesh habamis in some way. We're talking about the healthy part. So even though, yes, they may be blocked by their traumas or by their repeated transgressions or their addictions, go talk to an alcoholic, a drug addict, someone that's an addict. In the throes of their addiction, it's hard to imagine that if you start saying Shema, they're going to start listening. But you still believe that Shema has power and Kedusha, so maybe something will seep in. But remember, what's going on is that they're literally now controlled by another force, like a demon has taken over. So there you need additional interventions, which would include, just like the Chassidus doesn't say that if you learn Ayin Beis or Tanya and so on, is going to heal a person from cancer, for example, or it's going to heal a person from a disease or an illness. There you need a doctor. That's the way God made it. A person like that will probably need professional help to get out of their traps. And then you have this formula at work. But even before that, I would still say Kedusha has its way. You never know what's going to seep into a person. So even though you can't apply it quite literally what we're learning, in other words, it's not just a formula. Go, okay, say Shema, Vahafta, and you'll be freed from your addictions. So the 2 points I'm summing up is, one is that it could have some impact, but they will need most likely other interventions to help the person get beyond what they are. So then you can apply this formula. I just wanted to add that because just to make this more applied and practical to situations that would seem like a person's not even ready to engage on this level, that it's relevant to them as well in some form or fashion. Okay. Now, if anyone has any questions, I'll stop for questions, being that I wouldn't call this digress. I think it's just broadening what he's discussing in Ayin Beis to applying it in all given situations. So if there are any questions, I'm happy to take any questions, and then we'll continue. Okay, so on 1466, line 3, and I stopped intentionally right before this line, even though it's like the middle of a sentence, because it starts a new idea. Well, it's not a new idea. It starts a new point. So we're talking about the transformation of the animal soul through the Nefesh Halikis's, of course, efforts, both in Seichel and the Midas. So then, Va'oz harihu nichel ba'era likid Nefesh Halikis, to the point, I should say, she is chashechel nehera, transform darkness to light, which I should add is a big theme in volume 2, when he talks about transforming the tzimtzum. So he says clearly the tzimtzum in Aveda is the nefesh habamis. So you don't just ignore the tzimtzum. You don't just ignore the animal soul. You don't just bypass it or override it. You're transforming it. And here we see clearly this transformation. Nefesh habamis is understanding godliness through the seichel and being affected by the emotions. And then it's encompassed or absorbed into the light of the divine soul. And here's where we continue. And what level is this? You can say maybe it's a low level of bittul. He says no. That ultimately it's the bittul of Yechud Elah. Now, why he doesn't say first Yechud Tata and then Yechud Elah? I think because he's just really saying it very briefly, and later he's actually going to talk about Yechud Tata and Yechud Elah, and even higher, the Yechud of both those Yechudim. So he's saying the bittul because it's a sabcha chashech l'neheres, so the nefesh habamis is ultimately being impacted, even Yechud Elah. But he does right away qualify, Kamoishi is bar be'ezus Hashem is barach, as shall be explained with God's help. And I will say that he explains it briefly, but the real extended explanation, I would say it was never finished by the Rebbe Rashab, but it is understood from the Maimon of a Magbi, from the Alter Rebbe and the Mittler Rebbe. I actually wrote to myself a note on the side here that the end of this page, the bottom of this page, he goes back to this Yechud Elah, and then from page 1472 and on till the end is continuing to discuss it, but he never gets back to the effect on the Nefesh Habamis. The Rebbe Rashab will end Ayin Beis on the note that the Nefesh Elikis contemplates on three Yechudim: Yechud Tata, Yechud Elah, and the Yichud, the unification of those two. And that's hinted to in Shema Yisrael, Hashem Elokeinu, Hashem Echad, and Baruch Shem, or Baruch Shem is like the second level, or Hashem Echad is the second level, and then the joining of both of them. But he never gets back to how that affects the animal soul, or further, the Haftas Hashem Elokecha b'chol levavcha b'shnei yitzorecha, how the emotions affect the animal soul's emotions. But from this parentheses, clearly he was going to discuss it. And that's part of what I wrote in my essay that I'm writing on this whole siyum of Ayin Beis, that addressing what most likely the Rebbe Rashab would have articulated. But being that he leaves us these signs, these hints, you could figure out that he's basically saying that the bittul of the Nefesh Elikis and Hashem Echad is not just a bittul of Yechud Tata, which means there's a yesh, like the Nefesh Habamis is a yesh, but that yesh is batul. So the first step would be the animal soul recognizes that I exist, but I'm completely nullified in the presence of something greater. Yechud Allah is saying nothing else exists but godliness. So he's saying clearly that the effect of the Nefesh Elikis and Nefesh Habamis is all the way to the level of Bittul of Yechud Allah, and later we'll learn the joining of the two, that both the yesh itself recognizing there's nothing but godliness. But we'll learn that later. So that's what he's adding here. And the bittul of Yechud Elah. So he's already hinting to something he would discuss later. And as I said, most of it he does not discuss, but he lays the ground for it all, so we could figure it out more or less. So here's one of the places where the need for the Maimar HaMagbi is so critical to really understand how this would have developed. But the Rebbe Rashab leaves us enough information to be able to figure that out. Okay. So now he's going to explain. Because since the Nefesh Elikis is engaging with the animal soul, the divine soul is engaging. Now the divine soul is, of course, higher than the animal soul, far higher. Its entire being, he said clearly, is rak, only to know and to experience godliness. Does no other interest. Made that very clear on page 1464. The Nefesh Habamis, on the other hand, its initial interest is only itself. They come together. Nefesh Elikis is impacting Nefesh Habamis, but to what extent? Can the Nefesh Elikis teach the Nefesh Habamis about God? Yes. The importance and primacy of godliness? Yes. But can it teach it the bittul, exclusive bittul of Yechud Elah? So he's saying yes, even that. And that's what he continues. Dehini ba Nefesh Elikis, because the divine, in the divine soul, b'chinas tachlis hatev, its ultimate good. So Nefesh Elikis also has levels. But what's the ultimate place that Nefesh Elikis achieves? Both in the Tachlis HaTev, the utter perfection. Tev here would be mostly perfection, more than just good. And the Eid Elikisha Bay, and the divine light within it. Hu b'chinas habitl, not just of Yechud Tata, the Yechud Elah dafke. Nefesh Elikis, in its natural habitat, knows nothing else but God. Nefesh Elikis doesn't say, I exist, and therefore I want to see God, or I want to feel God, I want to experience God. It's completely sublimated in godliness. Yechud Elah dafke. Ki habitl Yechud Tata, because the bitl of Yechud Tata, the lower Yechud. means there's a yesh, but the yesh comes to discover and comes to appreciate that it has a source, and therefore it's subjugated to it. Shazeh b'chinas das tachten yichud tata, which is das tachten, means the perspective from below, from the yesh, looking upward to the ayin. Harinikra eitz das tevara. That's called the eitz das, the tree of knowledge, and there's a mix of tevara. It's not tachlis hatev. Tevara means it's a combination of godliness and the opposite of godliness. Shebezeh gufa yesh adayin taruvis ra. So in this itself, in this very level, there's still a mix of taruvis ra, meaning it's not just purely elikus or purely goodness. Shezeu mashakosa b'keres hakedesh dibra maskul v'hoye ma'aseh tzedakah. This is what it says in the Keres hakedesh in Tanya, in the section that begins v'hoye ma'aseh tzedakah shalom taruvis rasha benafshe. That he still has taruvis ra, a mixture of ra is evil, but here evil means antithetical to godliness in his nefesh. Why? Why is that in das tachten? Because in das tachten, even if there's bittul, habittul hu b'bchinas yesh umurgish. It's not utter absorption into elikus. There's still a yesh. There's an existing entity umurgish, and it senses itself. There's a feeling, a sense of that. So even though it's a yesh that's bottle, but since there's a yesh there, so there's a possibility, it leaves room for taruvas ra. Even though at this moment it could be completely bottle, but it's not been really completely transformed. Just as an example, a small example, it's not a perfect example, but it's an example he used earlier. Bittul hayesh. He says Bittul hayesh could be example. You have a teacher, a great master teacher, and he has students. This teacher himself has a great teacher that he learned by. So when this teacher is with his students, he's of course the mashpia, he's the rav. When he comes into the presence of his own teacher, he's going to be humble and silent. Even though in comparison to his students, he's a mitzias, but in comparison to his master, he's not quiet. He won't speak in front of him. He'll defer to him. So if his students were there, they say, wow, our teacher has bittul. Is that bittul mitzias or bittul hayesh? So the answer is bittul hayesh. Not because of arrogance, God forbid, but he's not really bottled, because the fact is he's like the candle in the light of the sun. When you're in presence of the sun, the candle is not going to shine. On the contrary, it'll actually be dark. When the sun is gone, the sun sets, you light a candle. The candle can be a lifesaver. It illuminates the room. So it's not that the candle was bottled, the mitzias, completely nullified in the presence of the sun. For now, it's nullified, but it didn't really transform. So though this is not a negative thing, because the teacher needs to be a teacher for his own students, but it means the yeshus and the hedgosha of his has not really been transformed. Transformation would be that even when he's not in the presence of his teacher, he has that utter bittul. It's just an example. There are other examples as well. But the bottom line is it's a bittul, but because there's still an element of an existing entity, so there's the possibility, possibility for taruvas ra. Whereas a person who's completely bottled, there's no room for that, because he doesn't have any sense of self altogether. Not in the presence of his teacher, not in his own presence. V'ze'in habchira. I'm going to stop soon for questions, but I want to finish the whole topic here. And this is the idea of choice, free will. Shekeshem sheyochel lifka b'teiv. Just as he can choose goodness, kein yochel lifka b'hepech chas v'shalom, so too can he choose the opposite. That means taruvas tevera, that there's choice. It doesn't mean necessarily that he does choose, but there's a room to choose. And that's only possible in das tachten. When you're living in the world where there's only God consciousness, you don't even have that possibility. Like Eirei Sub before the Tzimtzum. There's no room for anything else. There's only one reality, God, godliness. Yichud Elah. But Yichud Tata, what he calls it is Dafkin Das Tacht. Ukamoi came Bahamidis. Haboim Mizeh. And same thing is in the midas that come from this level of Das Tachten, or what he's calling here the Yesh and the Murgish. Mipnei Shehem B'Murgish, B'Bchinas Yesh, being that the midas are in a state of hergish, that they feel themselves. They sense, you sense what you feel. Yesh, yesh misha oyev, I should say. From Tanya, there's an expression. There's someone who loves. You can't say there's no one exists. When you say someone loves God, there's that individual is loving God. So right there, you have a yesh. You can't call that yichud ilah on the full level of total bittul. So yachalias avazara kaneda. So even though at this moment he's loving God, but being there as a yesh, it's also possible, just like with bchira, possible that he should also have an avazara. Ava means to something that's a strange thing, which is the opposite of kedusha, kaneda, as it's known. Valkein einze amitis habitl. And therefore you can't call it utter and total and exclusive bittul. Ki'im b'chinas habittul. Okay, right. That's the bittul of Yechudat HaTodas. Where do you find true bittul? Rather, ki'im b'chinas habittul Yechudat Ilah. That's what we call tachlis hatev. That's why I use the word tev. There's no ra altogether, no possible ra. That's called utter perfection or utter goodness. V'u'amitis b'chinas alakusha b'neshama. And that's the ultimate level of elikus that's in the neshama, meaning in the divine soul. So now, what's he established here? That the nefesh elikis does have this sense, even though when it comes down below, obviously it's concealed to some extent, but nefesh elikis fundamentally at its core is only thing it knows is godliness. So now he says, since the nefesh elikis has this, and the nefesh elikis has entered into the nefesh habamis, now he's going to conclude that's why it can transfer over. He says, nasa bittul b'nefesh habamis. And this level of Yichud Ilah not only affects the Nefesh Habamis to subdue it, or to tame it, or to suppress it, that would still be iskafi, that would still be Bittul of Yichud Tata. But B'chinas ishapche chashech al nehera, to actually transform the darkness of the animal soul into light. V'zeh inyan hapsila. And that's ultimately, when you look at now go back to Ner Hashem Nishmas Adam, and you see how fascinating the Rebbe Rashab is basically spelling out what the Alter Rebbe more or less says, because at the end of the day, when you look at a candle, what do you see? You see one flame. You don't see two flames. One flame, one wick, and oil, shemen, that's fueling it. So what is going on here? Where's the Nefesh Habamis? Where's all the negative stuff of the Nefesh Habamis? Where's its yeshus? Where's its self-interest, both in Seichel and Midas? But clearly, in the Ner Hashem Nishmas Adam, the Nefesh Habamis has become totally absorbed by the wick to create this Eish Eliki, this Eir Eliki, as he said. So that's so even though the Alter Rebbe he doesn't say it explicitly, the Rebbe Rashab here is saying it. So it means that the Nefesh Habamis was transformed, not just subdued. Subdued would mean that even though the Nefesh Habamis is there, the shemen, let's say the shemen was polluted. Even though it's there, it's not affecting the Nefesh Elikis from doing its work. But here it's more than that. The shemen has been converted into fuel for the flame. What flame is this? The love of God, the light of God. So that's what he says. And that's the psila, Shuha Nefesh Elikis, the wick, which is the divine soul. Shuha B'chinas Memutza. Lahamshicha Eir L'Hoyeres HaNefesh Habamis. It's like a mamutza between the flame, between the light and the shemen of the Nefesh Habamis, to draw the Eir and to lahayir and illuminate the Nefesh Habamis, ad sheyuchlel gamkein, the b'chinas ha'Eir Eliki, the neshama, that it too should become absorbed and completely consumed, because that's what happens with the shemen. The shemen is being consumed to the point there's no longer oil, the oil has become fire. So Nefesh Habamis has been transformed, not just been subdued. It becomes Eir Eliki, the neshama. Now, frankly, before we learned the Maimar HaMagbi, I remember when I taught this the first time, I didn't appreciate the extent of what he's saying here. Now, when you know the Maimar HaMagbi, and then you see the Rebbe Rashab, you see how the Rebbe Rashab is taking it to the so-called natural conclusion that it's a total transformation. And now let's go back to what he said, that the Nefesh Habamis is shemen because it comes from Toyu, and it increases. So the Nefesh Elikis gives to the Nefesh Habamis to harness it and to become part of this process. Now the Nefesh Habamis in return creates a tremendous intensity, Ribia Eir, Because if you didn't have the oil, the candle would burn out very quickly. So now comes not the Yisra Na'ir that comes dafka from the Cheshach of the Nefesh Habamis, of the Shemen that initially began as Cheshach. Ushayidei hayirida lamata dafka. Like we learned earlier, as dafka to the neshama coming down below into a dark world, into Nefesh Habamis. That dafka there, the neshama will come, the Nefesh Kispa, the B'chinas Ava Rabba v'Ava B'Tainugim. That tremendous great love and the love of pleasure that even the Maila neshama does not have, that intensity that comes from the thirst. As we learned earlier, page 1455 and on, like 10 pages ago, in the concept, the idea that we learned, Shcherani, I am dark, but I am beautiful, even more beautiful than B'nai Yerushalayim, the neshamas in Gan Eden, and even in Atzilus, because this Ava Rabba Ava B'Tanugim, and he says the neshama's connection to Atzmos comes dafke below with is the Cheshach. So now we understand how the Nefesh Habamis plays such a tremendous role. Not just, so initially it's coming, the Nefesh Halikis, to be Mavarer, Mesakin, to refine the animal soul. Now we see how the animal soul is actually causing the neshama to get back to its original source, the Atzmos, in the deepest way, like example with the Er Hariyah, that we don't see with an outside light, like it is down below with the eye, once it's in the side, with a vision within the physical eye, needs a siyua of an outside light that the eye itself can see. That the neshama itself, it does not need a siyua, it itself can see. Like I'm using language that he spoke about earlier, just to connect it all. And with that, he concludes this paragraph and this idea. And as you'll see, the next section, he starts going back to mitzvahs, but really goes back to the hisbonenus of the nefesh halikis. What exactly does this contemplation consist of, and how does it actually impact the animal soul? Is going to be basically the theme of the next 10, 11 pages till the end of Ayin Beis, and with what we know from the other Maimorim, the continuation that would have most likely, the Rebbe Rasha would have most likely continued. But we'll get to that when we get there. So I stop here by the end of this paragraph. Let's see if anyone has any questions. And yeah, okay. So this really ties it up beautifully. Good. Any questions?
I have a question. That on this second time around, I see the Rebbe's saying that you can't, or a person, it seems, can't reach Yichudei Ilah unless there's a complete transformation of the Yetzer Hara, because the Yichud Ilah is just, it's only Tov. You can't have can't leave any space for Taruvas Ra. So that to me sounds like the place of a tzaddik. And how can anybody who's not a tzaddik reach Yichud Ilah? And yet, we're going to talk about Shema quite a bit, and how each of us can find that Yichud Ilah, in our own terms. And we talked about the perspective of how God sees reality, the universe, from his perspective. Can we try to see it from him? So I'm a little confused. Can I reach Yichud Ilah or not?
What's the question?
Can we reach
right now, today?
Yeah.
Relative to your Yehuda Tata, you could probably reach. It's like we say, B'chol Levavcha. The same question I would ask: can you reach B'chol Oidecha? The fact is, you say Shema every day, and you say B'chol Levavcha, B'chol Nafsha, B'chol Oidecha. You talk to your mashpia, and you could spell out on your level what is B'chol Levavcha, what's B'chol Nafsha, B'chol Oidecha. You could also speak about what's Shema Yisrael on your level, what's Baruch Shem on your level, what's V'ahavta. So everybody on their level, relative to their level, it's all relative. There's no objective Yichudei Law per se. Then there's obviously higher levels, and it's a constant journey.
But I'm
then there's Bizman Hazeh, and then there's L'Oseh. So this is a journey, the normal journey of maturity of how a person grows in all their Avodah. Every person in their level. If you're asking about you personally, that's the only way to go.
No, I understand, and that's how we learned it the first time. But if reaching,
it doesn't change. Nothing. That doesn't change. The learning of it is just understanding all the aspects of it. But ultimately, the goal is to why don't you ask a better question? Can your Nefesh Habamis become completely Shemen oil for nefesh alikis, or you're still going to have a nefesh abamis.
Right.
Obviously,
That's
we
the same
understand.
question.
So,
Same question.
so he's talking here the ultimate, but relative. Everybody can find relative to them, relative to your nefesh abamis of yesterday. Today, it could
Uh-huh.
become more consumed. It's all relative in that context.
Okay. Thank you.
And the Rebbe Rashab is painting the whole picture from all levels, covering all people, all situations. Look, the pasuk says, that's the basis of all of Tanya. You think the Karve Lecha of a tzaddik is the same as the Karve Lecha of a Beinani or of a Rasha? Or even among us all, everybody here in this class right now, every one of us have the same level of Karve Lecha? No. The pasuk is telling us a rule that it's relevant, it's accessible, it's reachable, achievable, that godliness in your life. But it all comes down to where you stand and how much avodah you did, and all many other factors. So the point is that everybody can reach these levels on their level. Famous story of Rab Zusha, he was crying, and he said, I'm crying not because I'm not like this one, I'm crying whether they're going to ask me, do you like Zusha? We have to be able to answer only one accountability question. Did you live up to your potential, to your ability?
Understood. Thank you. Excellent point.
Yeah. Are there any other questions? I'll add one more thing, if I may. Rab Nissen Nemenov was a classic, famous chassid back from Russia, and then later he was the mashpia, the main mashpia in the Temchet Mimim, in the yeshiva in Brunois, near Paris, outside of Paris, the main yeshiva there. And some people thought he was a Beinani, but when he would give advice to Bochrim about self-control and self-mastery, the themes of Tanya, of how you moich shal talev, that even if you can't change your animal soul, you still can control it because you can exercise the ability that it shouldn't affect your thought, speech, and action. And we all know how difficult that is. Yeah, you can maintain it for a while, but can you really keep it up? So he would say often to Bochum and Fabrengens that the key is to understand every moment. Self-mastery, to say I'm going to exercise self-control the rest of my life, is a little too overwhelming and foreboding, too difficult. You have to just control the next second. The next second. If you can do every second, say right now, my Nefesh Abamis wants something, but you know what? I'm not going to give into it. And then the next second again, he says, look at it as a battle of seconds, not a battle of life. Because if it's going to be, I'm going to take upon myself not to give in to my Yetzer Hara for the next 5 months, for the next month, for the next week even. Usually not going to work because it's just not realistic for most people. It's like there was someone saying, I'm going to run a marathon every day of 22 miles. It's just not going to happen. But if you say, I'm going to run every day for 20 minutes, a half hour, same idea, that the key is the Chassidus lays out the formula, but it's not actually baking the cake for you. This is the recipe. And it lays out the whole picture and the ultimate. Now it comes to each of us taking it and saying, okay, how could I realistically apply this to my life? So there are moments, I am sure everybody can find moments in your life where your Yetzer Hara and Nefesh Abamis were completely ineffective on you. You were completely consumed with something. Even, God forbid, let's say an emergency. No one should ever have emergencies. But let's say you have to rush for an emergency to help a loved one. You think at that moment the Nefesh Abamis says, hey, you know what? Before you go there, let's stop for a delicious lunch. I'm using, obviously, a mild temptation. But let's say even something stronger. You're not even going to listen to it. Why? Because now you have something urgent to do. There's an emergency at stake. The building is burning, God forbid. I'm only using a negative example, but the same thing, you're marrying off a child tonight. Well, not tonight because it's Sphira, but you understand my point. An example. And someone will say, you know what, let's take off half the day, we're going to go play golf, or whatever a person has a desire for. It's not the time because there's a priority in your life that's taken over, and that's it. It's not because your nefesh habamis was eliminated or annihilated. It's going to come back full force at some point. But what you've done is you've filled your life with something, at that moment at least, that you can say, like the Rebbe says in Tanya, when it says about the Beni in chapter 12, that he never did an Avera and never will do an Avera. So the obvious question is, what do you mean? How could anybody, no one's a Beni? Everyone has done an Avera in their life, at least one. You could say, maybe from here on, I'm going to try not to. But even that may not be. So how could you say, so the Rebbe adds, it means ba'osei shah, meaning at that moment, he's as if someone that never did an Avera never will do one. Because you bring yourself to a point of true commitment that you really, not in a fake way. No, Yom Kippur, this could happen. I've heard it from many people. Yom Kippur, not the whole day, maybe the end of the day, whatever. There are moments. The point is that the key is to find a way that works for you, that's realistic, more than usual. Like you have to push yourself. Like I say, do it till it hurts, but not overwhelmed, because then it's not going to keep up. You have to do something that's commensurate. Just like they say about dieting. If you take on upon yourself these extreme diets, they usually backfire. They almost always backfire. Yeah, you may lose weight for a while, and then it gets back to, because it's very hard to just change that. But if you change your lifestyle, and it's more in a more paced fashion, like like climbing steps, one step at a time, but consistent, that's usually the way, the method of growth. Just trying to point out how we apply this. Because we learn all these lofty ideas, it's very easy to just say this is not achievable. I can't even reach anything close to this. Yechud Tato would be a big chiddush, let alone Yechud Allah. But relatively speaking, you could find it, and it's all about practically applying it where you are in your life. Finding moments, you're learning, and so on. Your nefesh habamis is enjoying learning Ayin Beis, for example. Very likely, nefesh habamis is not right now has a hold on you this second to do something unacceptable. I'm not saying it's not possible. Of course, it's possible. The nefesh habamis is quite wily and has its tricks. But my point is, when nefesh habamis is engaged, you can start seeing. Is it possible to imagine a time where 24/7 you have the geschmack, the enjoyment of learning Ayin Beis, and the nefesh habamis is completely engaged with that and completely involved? Hypothetically, why not? If you can do it for an hour, why can't you do it for 10 hours, 1,000 hours? So it's not necessarily so realistic for many of us because we know ourselves, but this is part of the birur ha'elam, and we say Hashem will also help us. Ruach hatuma avim min haaretz. It's not completely up to us. We have to do our part, and then we have Hashem helping. He's not discussing that right here, but in other places, HaKadosh Baruch Hu that helps. That when you do a little part, Hashem will help and take care of the rest of it. And ultimately, we'll deal with the nefesh habamis and its so-called negative sides. So it's all part of a bigger picture of the whole story. Okay, good. So we will stop here. Any other questions? Anybody wants to ask anything? So I'll stop here. End of paragraph on page 1466.